She stood silently in the queue until the staff began to laugh at her. Staff began to laugh at her appearance and refused to let her into business class. She was searched in front of everyone, classified as suspicious, and the security forces were called. But when she only sent a text message, a man entered the airport that they definitely hadn't expected, and the situation changed within minutes. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments which country you're from. The sun had yet to rise when Gina O'Kelly awoke. The room was still dark, the air quiet, filled only with the soft hum of the ceiling fan. She didn't need an alarm clock. Her body, trained over years of early mornings and punctual commitments, knew the time. She sat up slowly, careful not to wake the dog still curled at the foot of the bed. Beside her, the other side of the mattress remained untouched. Chuck had flown out the night before for a speaking engagement in Denver. They had shared a quiet dinner before his departure, and he had kissed her forehead with a warm, familiar weight. He had offered to rearrange his schedule and accompany her. She had declined, smiling gently. "It's only a flight," she had said. "I'll be fine." She moved through the morning routine with unspoken grace. Her fingers brewed a small pot of black coffee. She sipped it slowly, the bitterness grounding her gaze fixed through the kitchen window at the soft suggestion of dawn on the horizon. The garden outside, carefully tended over the years, sat still beneath a thin veil of mist. Her suitcase, already packed the night before, waited beside the door. It was a modest-sized bag with worn leather edges, well-loved like its owner. She checked the contents again, not because she feared forgetting something, but because order had always been her form of calm. On the table sat a folded letter. It was from her friend Eleanor, the woman she was flying to see. Handwritten, in the familiar looped cursive Gina had always admired. The last line echoed in her mind. "I just want to see you one more time, if the good Lord allows." The words had clung to her since she'd read them. Eleanor was in a hospice center just outside Zurich, and while the doctors refused to say how long she had, Gina had been through enough to know what it meant when they spoke in metaphors. This wasn't a leisurely trip. It was a promise, a farewell. She dressed in silence, choosing comfort over appearance. A pair of dark jeans, a soft cashmere sweater, and a long navy trench coat. Her hair she tied into a loose bun at the nape of her neck. Minimal makeup, a small crossbody purse, and a printed scarf folded carefully into her bag. She knew who she was and felt no need to prove it to anyone. That had come with age, with loss, with life. The driver, arranged through a trusted service, waited at the curb promptly at 5:30. The vehicle was unmarked and discreet. Gina locked the door behind her and slid into the back seat without fanfare. The ride to LAX was uneventful. She stared out the window most of the way, watching as the city transitioned from shadow to light. Neon signs faded, streetlights blinked off one by one, and joggers began to appear on sidewalks. The world, it seemed, was slowly waking up with her. When they arrived at the airport, she asked the driver to drop her at the main terminal rather than the private entrance reserved for high-profile travelers. It wasn't a matter of modesty. It was simply her preference today. She wanted to move through the world like everyone else. She wasn't here to make statements, only to get on a plane and see her friend. Inside, the terminal was already filling with early travelers. The aroma of overpriced coffee mingled with the industrial chill of recycled air. Gina moved through the automatic doors, suitcase rolling quietly behind her. The signage was clear, international departures to the left. She walked with purpose, though without rush. Her gate wasn't boarding for another hour, and she had already checked in online. When she approached the business class counter of the airline, she paused briefly and glanced around. There were 3 attendants, 2 women and a young man, all dressed in identical navy blue uniforms. Only one was actively assisting a passenger. Gina stepped into the open lane, resting her hand lightly on the counter. The young woman behind the desk didn't look up at first. She was typing with the kind of boredom only early morning shifts could bring. When she finally raised her head, her eyes flicked across Gina's face, then traveled down to her coat, her jeans, the modest suitcase. Her lips pursed ever so slightly. "Yes?" the woman asked, already shifting her attention back to the screen. Gina offered a pleasant smile. "Good morning. I'm checking in for the Zurich flight, business class." The woman blinked. "This is the business class line." "Yes," Gina said calmly. "That's why I'm here." There was a pause. The woman's fingers resumed their tapping. "Can I see your ID?" Gina handed over her passport and the printed confirmation of her booking. The woman glanced at it, her brows drawing together. She murmured. "Are you sure this is business class?" Gina tilted her head slightly. "Yes, it was booked through my husband's office. Should be under O'Kelly." The attendant clicked a few more keys, her expression unmoved. "Well, the system is acting up," she said after a moment. "You might want to go check with the economy counter. This lane is for priority customers." "I understand," Gina said evenly, "but my ticket is confirmed for business class. If the system is down, perhaps you can verify it manually." The woman exhaled through her nose. "Just a moment." She turned her head and called over another attendant, a young man with a headset slung lazily around his neck. He walked over, looked at the screen, then at Gina. "She says she's in business class," the woman said, her tone laced with disbelief. The young man looked at Gina again, his lips twitching. "You know what? I'll check it in the back," he said, though his expression suggested otherwise. Gina stood patiently, watching the quiet exchange. She could feel it, the subtle shift in atmosphere, the way they assessed her not based on her credentials, but on their assumptions. She had encountered it before, of course, in a dozen forms, but there was something sharper about this, something more deliberate. She glanced at the time. 6:12, still nearly an hour before departure. There was no reason for alarm. When the young man returned, he didn't meet her eyes. "Yeah, looks like your seat's been reassigned." "Reassigned to what?" she asked. He shrugged. "It happens. You'll need to talk to someone at gate services. But I checked in last night. I have the confirmation here." She held out her phone again. "We don't control seat assignments here," he said, avoiding her hand. "Maybe try again at a different desk." Before she could reply, the woman added, "It's probably a system error, or maybe the upgrade didn't go through. Happens with reward bookings." "It wasn't a reward booking," Gina said quietly. "It was paid in full." The woman's smile tightened. "Of course. Just head down the hall, ma'am." Gina stood there for another moment, holding the same calm she'd carried through a lifetime of being underestimated. But even as she walked toward the gate desk, a sense of unease stirred beneath her ribs. She had a strange feeling, an instinct she couldn't shake, that this wasn't just an error. It was something else, something quieter and more dangerous. By the time she reached the gate, the air around her had shifted. The boarding screen still showed the flight as on time, but the attendant here looked up at her with the same bland detachment. "Your name?" she asked. "O'Kelly, Gina." The woman scanned the list, her brow furrowed. "You've been flagged," she said flatly. "Flagged for what?" "Random review. You'll need to step aside while we process. I'm a 62-year-old woman traveling alone, on a business class ticket. What exactly am I being reviewed for?" "It's random." "No," Gina said, the calm in her voice now edged with steel. "It's not." And that was when the security team was called. It was not even 6:30, and the morning had only just begun. For a moment, Gina simply stood still, absorbing the bluntness of the gate agent's words. Flagged. It wasn't the word itself that stung, but the casual indifference with which it was delivered, as though her presence alone had warranted suspicion, as though she was already guilty of something undefined and unseen. Around her, the flow of early travelers continued uninterrupted. People wheeled luggage past her, sipped their coffee, scrolled through their phones. But in that moment, Gina felt distinctly cut off from the current of normalcy. She inhaled softly, adjusted the strap of her purse, and maintained her posture. Calm. Always calm. Her voice, when she replied, was measured. "I would like to speak with a supervisor, please." The woman at the desk didn't look up from her screen. "Ma'am, you've been flagged for additional screening. Please stand to the side." "I'm not refusing the process," Gina replied, still even, "but I am asking why. There must be a reason." "That's not information we're required to disclose," came the response. Another employee, a man with a lanyard dangling from his neck, appeared beside the desk, watching her with guarded disinterest. "Is there a problem here?" he asked the woman. "She's not cooperating," the agent answered, still typing. Gina turned to him. "I am cooperating. I simply asked to understand why I've been singled out. I have a confirmed seat in business class. I checked in last night. I have all the necessary documentation." The man's eyes flicked across her features, his mouth tightening. "We'll have someone assist you. Please, wait over there." He gestured toward a section of the terminal with a stanchioned-off area beside the counter, half hidden from view. Gina's suitcase bumped gently behind her as she moved to the indicated spot. She could feel eyes on her now, not just the staff's, but from others nearby. One woman whispered something to her companion, who turned and looked directly at Gina with a smirk. A teenager raised her phone discreetly, recording. A sense of being on display, of being judged without context, settled heavy on her shoulders. A few minutes passed before a new attendant approached her. This one wore a tighter uniform and a more formal badge. "Ma'am, we need to re-verify your credentials," she said with the air of someone checking off boxes rather than dealing with a human being. "You've already seen my passport and boarding confirmation," Gina replied. "Is there a discrepancy?" The woman didn't answer directly. "We'll need to examine your ID again. Please have it ready." Gina complied, producing her documents with quiet efficiency. The woman barely looked at them before walking away again. The absurdity of the situation pressed in. No explanations, no transparency. Just cold procedures cloaked in false politeness. It wasn't unfamiliar. Gina had moved through countless spaces over the years where perception outweighed facts, where assumptions walked ahead of introductions. But here, with the clock ticking and her flight approaching, it felt more personal. She glanced at the nearby digital display. 6:43. Boarding would begin soon. A new group of passengers joined the queue beside her, eyeing her with a mixture of curiosity and caution. One man, wearing a business suit and Bluetooth earpiece, looked her up and down, then looked away with an almost imperceptible shake of his head. The dismissiveness in that single gesture, so practiced, so habitual, tightened something in her chest. The male attendant returned, now with 2 TSA officers in tow. Their uniforms were crisp, their expressions unreadable. One of them was younger, mid-30s perhaps, with sharp eyes that flicked to her and then quickly away. The other was older, heavier, with a face that seemed carved from stone. "Ma'am," the younger one began, "we need you to come with us for additional screening." Gina's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Am I being detained?" "This is routine," the older one said. "No, it isn't," she replied softly. "I've flown internationally dozens of times in the past year. I've never once been flagged, and certainly not without explanation." "We're just following procedure, ma'am," said the younger officer. "Please, don't make this difficult." "I'm not being difficult," Gina said. "I'm standing where you told me to stand, waiting as requested. I'm only asking questions which I have a right to do. Please come with us." She looked at them for a moment, then nodded. "Very well." They led her through a side hallway, away from the main flow of passengers. The linoleum beneath her shoes squeaked faintly with every step. Overhead, fluorescent lights buzzed with a low hum. The hallway was narrow, clinical, and unwelcoming. Inside the small holding area, a secondary officer was waiting. She didn't speak, only nodded to the others, who positioned themselves by the door. Gina stood tall, shoulders back. "I would like to know why I was removed from the gate area. I have a flight boarding in less than 30 minutes. This delay will make me miss it." The female officer approached. "We're conducting a pat-down screening. Please stand with your arms out." "No probable cause, no explanation?" Gina asked, the coolness in her voice more pronounced now. The officer said nothing. Gina slowly raised her arms. The pat-down was clinical and impersonal. Hands ran over her arms, sides, down her legs. Her scarf was removed, inspected, and tossed onto a nearby metal table. Her carry-on was opened, the contents pulled out piece by piece. Her toiletry bag was unzipped, her vitamins shaken out, her book opened and thumbed through. Her phone was taken and examined for several long moments. They didn't find anything, of course. There was nothing to find. And yet the silence was the loudest part of it all. No apology, no acknowledgement, just cold hands and colder glances. As they rifled through her papers, she resisted the urge to snap them back into her bag. Her cheeks burned, not from guilt, but from the sheer degradation of it all. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Finally, she spoke again. "What is the reason for this? Why was I flagged?" A TSA agent, one of the originals, looked up, surprised she had spoken. "Ma'am, I don't handle that. That's the airline. We were called because you were being disruptive." Gina stared at him. "Disruptive?" He shrugged. "That's what we were told." I asked a question. I stood in line. I showed identification. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. His job was done. Gina looked at her watch. 7:16. The flight was gone. She sat down slowly in the cold metal chair beside the table, her hands resting gently on her knees. Her eyes fixed on a stain in the linoleum. Her throat was tight, but her face remained composed. She had not cried. She would not cry. She wasn't just missing a flight anymore. She was missing a goodbye. She was missing her friend. Outside the small room, the world continued moving. But here, in this sterile pocket of the terminal, Gina had been quietly punished for nothing more than failing to meet someone else's idea of who belonged where. The TSA agents began to murmur among themselves, their voices low. One stepped outside to make a call, the others avoided her gaze. Gina reached for her phone, now returned to her, and typed a brief message with steady fingers. "I was pulled. I missed the flight. I need you here." She hit send and closed her eyes. It was 7:18. She had done everything right. And still, here she sat, alone, but she would not remain so for long. The silence inside the small holding room was oppressive. Gina sat motionless, her legs crossed at the ankles, hands folded neatly in her lap. Her bag, still half unzipped from the security search, sat on the metal table in front of her, its contents in disarray. An opened cosmetic case, a folded silk scarf now crumpled, a paperback novel bent at the spine. Her documents, once methodically arranged, lay scattered like debris after a storm. She could feel the residual sting in her throat, not from tears, which had never come, but from the restraint it took to hold them back. Outside the room, she could hear the faint rustle of voices and movement, as if life was continuing uninterrupted just beyond her reach. The TSA officers hadn't spoken much since the last one exited to make a call. The remaining two loitered near the door, trading glances that said little and meant less. One stood with arms crossed, eyes averted, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to act. The other fidgeted with his belt radio, pretending to check settings that didn't need adjusting. Neither had addressed her again since confirming that her flight had already left. There was no offer of assistance, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, only the persistent blank presence of authority that refused to account for its choices. Time slowed in those minutes. Gina's phone rested in her lap, screen dimmed after her message had gone out. She hadn't received a reply yet. She didn't need one. The act of sending it, of reaching out, had been enough to shift something inside her. She had held the line, remained composed, not for anyone else's approval, but for herself. Now she waited. Not helplessly, not with desperation, but with the quiet, measured certainty of someone who knew they were not alone. 20 minutes later, the door at the end of the corridor slid open. The buzz of the sensor was followed by footsteps, unhurried but deliberate. The TSA officers straightened instinctively, one adjusting his stance, the other stepping slightly away from the wall. Gina didn't stand immediately. She waited, listening, letting the sound of his approach fill the room before lifting her head. Chuck Norris entered the room like a change in weather, cool, exact, undeniable. He wore a dark gray field coat over a black collared shirt, the fabric of his slacks catching the overhead light with every step. A deep burgundy scarf, the one Gina had given him last Christmas, hung loosely around his neck. His hair, touched with silver at the temples, was neatly combed back, and his eyes, steel blue, unwavering, scanned the room with sharp clarity. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Chuck's gaze locked first on Gina. His expression softened only slightly, enough for her to know he'd seen her, had read the exhaustion in her eyes, the weariness in her posture. He crossed the space to her without hesitation. She stood then, meeting him halfway. No words were exchanged. None were needed. He turned to the closest TSA officer. His voice was calm, firm, and carried the weight of decades spent commanding respect without demanding it. "Who's in charge here?" The officer blinked. "Sir, may I ask who you—" "Franklin Charles Norris, retired federal judge, Ninth Circuit." The words landed with the precision of a gavel. "Now, I'll ask again. Who's in charge?" The second officer hesitated, then fumbled with his radio. "Let me get a supervisor." Chuck turned back to Gina, lowering his voice. "Are you all right?" She nodded once. "Missed the flight. They flagged me at the gate. No reason given." He looked down at the disheveled state of her belongings, the open bag, the undone zipper. His jaw tightened. "Did you raise your voice?" "No." "Make a scene?" "No." When the supervisor arrived, an overweight man with a laminated badge clipped to his belt and a walkie-talkie bouncing at his side, his pace faltered the moment he saw Chuck. His eyes flicked to Gina, then to the TSA agents, then back to Chuck again, calculating. "Judge Norris," he said, extending a hand halfway, "we weren't aware you—" Chuck didn't take the hand. He cut him off cleanly. "I'm not here for introductions. Why was my wife's seat reassigned without explanation? Why was she removed from the boarding area and subjected to a full security pat-down?" The supervisor's mouth opened, then closed. He glanced at the officers, searching for a lifeline. "I'd have to check with the gate," he finally said. "Then check." The man nodded and turned to leave, muttering into his walkie-talkie as he backed out of the room. Chuck turned next to the attendant who had called security, a young man who had re-entered the room minutes before and was now trying to blend into the background. "You—" The word wasn't shouted, yet it struck like thunder. "What was your reason for calling security?" The attendant stammered. She wouldn't step aside. She kept asking about her seat." "Did she shout?" "No, sir." "Did she threaten anyone?" "No." Chuck stepped forward slightly, enough to make the gap between them feel uncomfortably small. "Then you do understand that what you did qualifies as targeted escalation, that calling security on someone who asked a question, especially a woman traveling alone, especially a woman of her age, is not just poor judgment, it's potentially a civil violation." "I didn't know who she was," the attendant muttered. Chuck didn't blink. "It shouldn't matter." Behind him, the door opened again, and a new face appeared, a woman in a dark blazer with the airline's crest on her lapel. She looked between Chuck and Gina, clearly briefed on what was unfolding, and forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We'd like to offer you rebooking," she began. "First class on the next available." "She doesn't need a better seat," Chuck interrupted. "She needed basic dignity 30 minutes ago. She needed someone to see her as a person." Gina stepped forward then. Her voice was soft but unmistakably firm. "He's not trying to get me a seat. He's trying to make you understand that this wasn't just a mistake. This was a choice. A decision to assume the worst of someone because they didn't match your image of who belonged in business class." The attendant lowered his head. From the hallway, more people began to gather. Passengers who had witnessed the initial confrontation, employees who sensed something big was happening. A woman with a phone in hand began recording again. Another employee whispered something to a colleague who turned on their heel and disappeared down the corridor. The air in the room grew thick, charged with the kind of tension that couldn't be cut, only endured. Chuck looked back at the supervisor, now returned and standing awkwardly near the door. "I want the name of the person who authorized the security call," Chuck said. "The one who decided my wife was a threat because she dared to ask a question." "That's a personnel matter," the supervisor replied, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Chuck's voice dropped. "So is discrimination." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the TSA officers said nothing. Gina didn't speak again. She stood beside her husband, hands loosely clasped in front of her, watching how it all unfolded. She had said what she needed to say. Now she was listening, not to be swayed or soothed, but to witness, to remember. "You detained a sitting federal judge's spouse," Chuck continued. "You ignored valid documentation. You escalated a situation that was never a threat. all because someone decided she didn't look the part. The supervisor swallowed. "We'll speak with our regional leadership." "You'll do more than that," Chuck said. "You'll begin a formal review. You'll document everything that happened, and you'll issue a public apology, not just to her, but to everyone like her who was treated this way and didn't have someone to walk through those doors for them." No one argued. No one spoke. At that moment, the buzz of a departing flight echoed from the nearby gates. But here, in this corner of the airport, time had stopped, and the reckoning had begun. The terminal no longer buzzed with the usual pre-boarding chatter. In the immediate vicinity of the security checkpoint and the surrounding gates, there was a peculiar hush, a silence punctuated only by the low crackle of radios and the soft hum of air conditioning vents overhead. It wasn't the kind of quiet born of calm, but of tension, of people holding their breath in the presence of something that had tipped the balance of a normal day. And at the center of it all stood Gina, her dignity intact, her composure unshaken, despite the humiliation she had endured in plain view. When Chuck had arrived only minutes earlier, the shift in energy had been immediate. He hadn't come storming through the doors like some action hero on a mission to rescue the damsel in distress. No, his entrance had been deliberate and controlled, every step measured, every glance calculated. There was power in the silence he carried with him, in the way people instinctively parted as he passed. It wasn't just his name, though anyone with a television or pulse knew it. It was the way he wore his presence like armor, calm, unshakable, immovable. Now, as he stood before a growing collection of TSA officers, airline supervisors, and red-faced attendants, that presence expanded. He wasn't speaking in catchphrases or issuing threats. He didn't need to. Chuck Norris didn't trade in bravado. He dealt in consequence, and those who had underestimated the woman sitting quietly in that cold metal chair, now standing beside him, were just beginning to understand the gravity of their error. The supervisor, whose badge read Henderson, was sweating visibly, though the temperature in the terminal hadn't changed. He had just returned from a whispered conversation with someone on the other end of his walkie-talkie, and the news, whatever it had been, had not bolstered his confidence. Chuck's questions hung in the air like suspended weights, questions that demanded more than procedural deflection. Questions about names, about decisions, about accountability. And now there were eyes everywhere. Passengers leaning subtly in the distance, employees frozen mid-task, phones raised discreetly at waist level, capturing snippets of this unfolding reckoning. Chuck didn't look at the cameras. He didn't need to acknowledge them. His focus remained on Henderson, whose throat bobbed as he tried to maintain composure. "I asked you for the name of the person who initiated the security escalation," Chuck repeated, his voice low but sharp enough to cut glass. "The individual who made the call that my wife was a threat for inquiring about her seat assignment. That information is protected under internal policy," Henderson said again, this time with noticeably less conviction. Chuck didn't move closer, didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The space between them already pulsed with a quiet tension. What's protected is the safety and dignity of every passenger who moves through this airport. Your internal policy does not supersede civil protections or human decency. Beside him, Gina remained still, her expression composed, though her eyes remained locked on the young male attendant who had dismissed her earlier. He was now visibly distressed, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, lips pressed together in a tight line. His smirk was gone, replaced by the pale realization that this was no longer an inconvenient interaction with a difficult customer. This was exposure. public, irreversible exposure. The female agent from earlier, now clearly identified as one of the airline's guest services coordinators, stepped forward with a new tactic. "Mr. Norris, we deeply regret how your wife was treated," she began, her voice carefully pitched. "We are actively reviewing the incident and will take immediate steps to ensure it doesn't happen again." Chuck turned his gaze on her. "What were the steps taken before she missed her flight? Before you laid hands on her? Before you upended her belongings, ignored her credentials, and publicly humiliated her?" The woman faltered. "We were following protocols. There was a concern." "Concern based on what?" he asked evenly. "Her tone, her clothing, her skin?" A hush fell again. The words weren't shouted, but they hit their mark with precise force. The implication wasn't accidental. Chuck knew how these games were played. So did Gina. And the people watching now, the ones with cameras and stunned expressions, knew it too. Even those who had initially ignored the commotion, even those who had laughed, began to understand that something much larger was unraveling before them. The assistant manager, a younger woman named Carla, approached with a clipboard and a look of barely contained panic. She tried to address Chuck, but he held up a hand to silence her. "This isn't about public relations," he said. "This isn't about saving face with an upgrade or an apology after the fact. This is about a cultural rot within your system that empowers employees to weaponize discretion against those they deem unworthy of courtesy. And today, you targeted my wife." He gestured slightly toward Gina. "You don't know her. You didn't ask her anything. You saw a woman traveling alone, modestly dressed, and you made decisions rooted not in policy, but in prejudice." Behind the cluster of staff, the crowd had grown. Not just travelers, but off-duty employees, maintenance workers, a few airline reps from other desks who had wandered over. A murmur ran through them, quiet but unmistakable. This was no longer just a confrontation. It was a moment, a reckoning unfolding in real time. Then, from the far end of the corridor, another figure arrived. A man in a tailored suit with the insignia of the airline's regional office embroidered discreetly near his collar. He looked like someone who had been called out of bed too early and into a disaster. His pace quickened as he approached, eyes darting between the gathered staff and the imposing man standing center stage. "Judge Norris," he said breathlessly. "Congresswoman." Gina raised an eyebrow. "Former," she corrected quietly. The man nodded. "We want to extend our sincerest apologies on behalf of the airline. We understand there was an incident involving our staff and that you were—" "You understand nothing," Chuck interrupted. "You're here because you were told to be, because this story is already out there." He gestured to the phones. "Your staff created a spectacle out of a woman who asked a question. You turned that into suspicion. You invited security into a situation that required only decency. And now you're reacting, not because it was wrong, but because it was public." The man looked chastened. "We take full responsibility for the actions of our employees. There will be disciplinary measures, retraining. There will be accountability," Chuck said, voice now ironclad, and not just performative. Names, reports, consequences. He turned to Gina. "Anything you want to say?" She looked at the staff gathered before her, at the young man who had refused to believe her, at the supervisor who had dismissed her without eye contact, at the agents who had searched her without cause. Her voice was gentle but firm. "Don't apologize because he came," she said. "Apologize because what you did was wrong. And you knew it the moment you did it." The finality of her words settled over the room like dust. Chuck turned again to the regional manager. She missed a flight she can't get back. A moment she'll never recover. There's no voucher for that. But what you will do today is make sure this never happens again. Not to her. Not to anyone who doesn't have someone like me to show up." The man nodded, speechless. Chuck stepped back, taking Gina's hand. Together they turned away from the circle of trembling staff and wide-eyed observers. No one followed. No one dared. As they walked toward the exit, the silence they left behind said more than any apology ever could. It said, "This happened. You did this, and we saw it. All of us. And now the world would see it too." The corridor they walked through seemed longer on the way out than it had on the way in. Gina and Chuck moved side by side, not in haste, but with a gravity that slowed the very air around them. Behind them, a wake of silence remained, like the aftershock of something tectonic. No one dared call after them. No supervisor chased them down with an awkward apology. No gate agent reached out to offer bottled water or a fresh boarding pass. Whatever resolve the airline staff had built up in that sterile space had collapsed the moment Gina chose not to flinch, and Chuck chose not to be silent. They didn't speak until they cleared the security hallway and stepped back into the open expanse of the terminal. The tension in Chuck's shoulders softened only slightly. Gina exhaled. It wasn't relief exactly. It was something closer to reclaiming breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for the last hour. Passengers parted around them like a tide, many of them whispering or nodding in recognition. Some paused and lifted phones discreetly. There were no shouts, no paparazzi, just an electric hum in the background that came not from celebrity, but from consequence. The story had spread, as Chuck knew it would. The phones that had recorded her humiliation had also recorded her restraint. They had captured Chuck's confrontation, his unwavering tone, and the sheer disbelief on the faces of the staff when they realized who she was, and, more importantly, who they were in that moment. Not just employees. Not just gate agents, but witnesses to their own undoing. When they reached a quieter section of the terminal, near a wall of windows overlooking the tarmac, Chuck stopped and turned toward her. His voice, as always, was calm. "Do you want to go back to the car?" Gina didn't answer immediately. She stared through the glass of the runway at a plane taxiing slowly toward the hangar and let the question settle. Then she shook her head. Not yet. Chuck nodded. He understood. She needed air, not oxygen, but space. Space to sift through the weight of everything she had just endured without immediately folding it back into the business of moving on. Space to allow the ache behind her eyes to dull before she blinked again. The airline's regional manager had not followed. Nor had Henderson, or the young attendant who had now, Chuck was certain, gone into hiding somewhere in a break room or a bathroom stall, clutching the full enormity of what he had done. Not just the disrespect, not just the escalation, but the knowledge that the woman he had rolled his eyes at, dismissed, humiliated, wasn't just anybody. She had power. Not loud power, not the kind that storms into rooms demanding things, but power rooted in self-worth, in a life lived with integrity. The kind that, when backed by a husband like Chuck Norris, could stop an entire airport in its tracks. Chuck leaned against a nearby railing, his arms folded, watching the automatic doors to the terminal. His posture was casual, but his eyes were not. They were trained, as if still expecting someone to run out after them, begging for another chance to make things right. But no one came, because no one knew how to fix what had already been broken in front of an audience. Gina took out her phone. The screen lit up with notifications, missed calls, text messages, social media alerts. She ignored them all, until one name caught her attention. It was her niece, Leanna, who had simply written, "I saw the video. Proud doesn't begin to cover it." She set the phone down and looked at Chuck. "They didn't expect you to show up," she said, her voice low. He glanced at her. "They didn't expect anyone to care." Gina nodded. Her mouth twitched, not quite into a smile. "They thought I was alone." For a long moment, they stood in silence again, watching planes lift and land through the long windows. Somewhere deeper in the terminal, an intercom called boarding for another flight, another gate, another story. But theirs had already taken off, without a plane. And it was circling fast. Back inside the secured area, the mood had changed. The employees who remained wore expressions of unease. There was a tremor under their polished professionalism. Some spoke in hushed voices behind counters. Others retreated to the break room, where the air was thick with the weight of what had just unfolded. In the far corner of the employee area, the young gate agent, Cullen, sat hunched in a plastic chair, hands clasped between his knees. His name tag was still clipped to his shirt, though it now felt absurdly inadequate, like a child's costume at a trial. The supervisor, who had tried and failed to control the situation, leaned against the door frame, arms folded. His tone, when he finally spoke, was devoid of reprimand. "You could have just looked at her ticket," he said quietly. Cullen didn't answer. The supervisor stepped into the room, closing the door gently behind him. "She asked one question," he continued. "She wasn't rude. She didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She asked why her seat had changed, and you treated her like she was trying to scam the system." "I didn't know who she was," Cullen mumbled. "That's the problem," the supervisor replied. "You thought that mattered." Cullen finally looked up. His face had lost its cocky confidence. In its place was the pale, shaky realization that this wasn't going to be forgotten. "They're already calling corporate," the supervisor added. "Legal's involved. Comms is drafting a statement. You just put us on the front page." "I thought she was being difficult," Cullen said weakly. She insisted on being treated like a person." Outside, the ripple had already become a wave. News outlets were picking up the story. The footage was spreading. Gina standing silently while being escorted by TSA, her ID held out in one hand, her dignity held in the other. Chuck confronting staff. Passengers muttering in the background, "Wait, is that Chuck Norris?" Followed by gasps of realization. On social media, commentary was swift and sharp. A woman asks why her seat changed and ends up being patted down. "What year is this?" She showed her credentials and they ignored her. Then Chuck Norris showed up and suddenly everyone had eyes. This happens every day to people without famous spouses. Let's not forget that. Gina didn't read the posts, not yet, but she knew they were there. She could feel the story growing legs, moving beyond the terminal, beyond her. She picked up her bag, finally zipped, and slung it over her shoulder. "Let's go," she said softly. Chuck gave her a long look. "You sure?" There's nothing left for them to explain. Together, they exited the terminal, walking beneath the rising sun, the day breaking clean across the sky. There were no cameras following them, no special escort, no scrambling employees hoping for redemption, just them. Two people who had lived long enough to know what power did and did not look like, and behind them, an airport that would not soon forget the lesson they had just been taught. But the most powerful part wasn't what Chuck said, or how Gina stood. It wasn't even the attention it gathered. It was the reckoning left in their silence. The reminder that sometimes when the system leans on its assumptions, it crashes under its own weight, and sometimes the people it tries to dismiss, to diminish, to forget, are the very ones who remind it how little it truly understands. Inside, someone finally called Gina's name over the intercom, but by then she had already left, and the world was listening. The late morning sun painted long golden streaks across the glass canopy of the terminal as Gina and Chuck stepped out into the world beyond the automatic doors. The hum of traffic met them first, the idle growl of engines, the sharp hiss of buses pulling in and away from the curb, the metallic clatter of rolling luggage across uneven pavement. But beneath the noise, there was a shift in the air, a new weight that didn't belong to the usual rhythm of departure and arrival. It was a weight of attention, of awareness, and, somewhere deeper, of unease. Chuck stood beside the car, holding the door open for Gina, who paused for just a moment before getting in. She glanced back, not to the building they had just left, not to the people still watching from behind tinted glass, but to the space itself, the scene of it all. There had been no apology worth naming, no effort sincere enough to undo the humiliation. And yet, she didn't linger in bitterness. The time for waiting had passed. Now it was time to let the dust settle behind her and to carry what mattered forward. Inside the vehicle, the air was cool, the scent of leather calming in contrast to the sterile tang of the terminal. Gina exhaled slowly, her fingers loosening their hold on the strap of her bag. Chuck slid into the seat beside her, giving her a moment before speaking. "They'll feel this," he said quietly. She turned her head. "They already are." And indeed they were. Back inside the terminal, chaos had finally begun to bubble beneath the surface of protocol. In a corner office tucked away from the public eye, a damage control meeting was in full motion. The airline's regional communications officer had arrived just minutes after Gina and Chuck had left, her face flushed from hurried travel and a constant stream of phone alerts. She hadn't even sat down before she started barking into her headset, coordinating statements, requests, and apologies that no longer had the power to reverse the damage. "It's not just trending," she said to the assembled staff. "It's viral. We're on 5 national outlets already. Local news picked it up within the hour. By this afternoon, it'll hit international circuits." "Have we released a statement?" someone asked. "We issued a placeholder," she replied. "Generic regret, standard language, but it's not enough." "What are they saying?" She turned her screen to show them. Comment sections, hashtags, video stills. Gina's face, composed and dignified, mid-frame as 2 TSA agents flanked her. Chuck's silhouette in the corridor, his finger pointed not in accusation, but in truth. One caption read, "She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The world heard her anyway." Beneath the post, a flood of voices, nurses, teachers, veterans, grandmothers, business travelers, all recounting their own stories of being dismissed, degraded, doubted. Many of them didn't know who Gina was. That didn't matter. They saw her as someone they recognized, someone who had worn their shoes, swallowed their anger, and been expected to say thank you for the insult. In another part of the airport, Cullen, the young gate agent, was no longer in uniform. He sat alone in the locker area, staring at his hands. His phone vibrated on the bench beside him. Another message, another mention, another video where his face, his smirk, his shrug was now a symbol of the worst kind of customer service. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. The voice of his supervisor echoed in his head from earlier that morning. You thought that mattered. He had, that was the truth of it. He'd seen an older woman traveling alone, dressed plainly, and assumed she was trying to cheat the system. He'd watched her speak with quiet confidence and mistook it for entitlement. And when she had asked a simple question, he had chosen not to answer. He had chosen escalation, because it was easier to dismiss her than to respect her. Now there was no escape from that choice. Meanwhile, in a nearby media suite set up for press conferences, reporters were already gathering. The airline's executive spokesperson was expected to arrive within the hour. A carefully worded statement was being crafted, one that would acknowledge the deep regret of the company, the failure in communication, and the unfortunate experience of a valued customer. It would mention steps being taken, training being reinforced, policies being reviewed, but it would not mention Gina by name. It would not address the cultural blind spot that had allowed her to be treated the way she was. It would not name those responsible. It would not speak of what it meant to humiliate someone who had done nothing wrong, because the company's lawyers had already advised, say too much, and you open the door to liability. Outside the corporate spin cycle, the truth traveled faster. Gina's name began trending on multiple platforms, not just as a victim of discrimination, but as a symbol of poise under pressure. A clip of her final words to the airline supervisor, "Apologize because it was wrong, not because he came," was being quoted on morning shows, printed on graphics, turned into slogans. Inside a quiet cafe near the airport entrance, a mother and her teenage daughter sat watching the footage. The girl, no older than 15, asked, "Why did they treat her like that?" The mother didn't answer right away. She watched the screen a little longer, then finally said, "Because they thought they could." But not anymore. Gina and Chuck, now back in their car, were headed home. The weight of the day settled into their bones as exhaustion overtook adrenaline. Gina sat with her hands in her lap, watching the city drift past the window. A part of her still ached, not just for the missed flight, not just for Eleanor waiting in Zurich, but for the deep sadness of knowing how common this experience was for people who couldn't summon justice with a text. She didn't regret speaking out, but she regretted the necessity of it. Chuck reached over and gently took her hand. "You did everything right," he said. "I know," she answered. Neither of them said much more for the rest of the ride. Words weren't needed. Not yet. Not with the story still unfolding beyond their control. That afternoon, Gina sat in their living room with the curtains half drawn, the light slanting through like quiet ribbons. Her phone buzzed again and again. Journalists, former colleagues, strangers from every corner of the country. One message from a woman in Arizona simply read, "I didn't have a title, so they talked to me like I was nothing. Thank you for not letting them do that to you." Another came from a father in Oakland. "The way they treated your wife is how they treated my father. He missed his heart surgery because they wouldn't believe his ID was real. No one apologized." It went on and on. Each story was a thread. Together, they formed a tapestry of everyday indignities, of systemic assumptions, of quiet rage. Later that evening, Chuck stepped into her office and found her typing. The screen glowed softly, illuminating her face. She didn't look up when he entered. "You're writing it down?" he asked. Gina nodded. "Not a statement, a letter, not just for them, for anyone who's been here before." He sat across from her, waiting as she finished the paragraph. Then she read it aloud. "This isn't just about one gate or one airline. It's about how quickly people in power forget the rules of human decency, about how easily a voice is dismissed when it doesn't wear wealth or status, and it's about how dignity should never be granted based on recognition. It should be the default for everyone. Always. Chuck exhaled slowly. That's the line. She nodded. It's the truth. They didn't know then how widely the letter would be shared, that schools would post it in classrooms, that advocacy groups would read it at community meetings, that politicians would quote it in sessions, that a quiet act of written resolve would carry just as much weight as the confrontation that had sparked it. But, for now, they were just two people in their home, a husband and wife, a man who had refused to let his partner be humiliated, a woman who had refused to shrink. The consequences were spreading fast, but the dignity, that remained. A week had passed since the airport incident, and still the story refused to fade. It lived not just in headlines or clipped news segments, but in dinner table conversations, podcast debates, Sunday sermons, and crowded classrooms. It had become more than a viral moment. It had become a mirror, one that people were forced to look into, whether they liked their reflection or not. For Gina, the days following that morning at the airport had unfolded in waves. Some moments were calm and clear. Others hit like surf against rock, unpredictable, exhausting, and loud. Her inbox, once reserved for event invitations and garden club newsletters, was now flooded with messages from strangers around the world. Veterans who'd been pulled from security lines for having Arabic surnames. Elderly women mistaken for stowaways because they didn't fit first-class profiles. Mothers whose children were questioned while traveling alone, their words ignored until a man showed up to speak for them. Each story a bruise, each message an echo. She hadn't responded to most of them. Not yet. She read them all, though, one by one, often with her glasses slipping low on her nose and the tea beside her gone cold. She wasn't sure what comfort she could offer, what solution she could give. She wasn't trying to become a movement. She wasn't looking to be a symbol. All she had wanted that morning was to get to her flight, to see her friend. But now she carried more than her own experience. Now she carried testimony, memory, and an unspoken agreement with every person who had ended a similar day in silence. The letter she had written, the one Chuck had listened to in the soft glow of her study, had been published in 3 national newspapers by the end of the week. It was reprinted in magazines, quoted on television, translated by human rights organizations into multiple languages. A senator from Georgia had opened a press conference with Gina's closing words. A pastor in Detroit had read them aloud in a Sunday sermon. A high school teacher in Montana had tacked it to a bulletin board beside a black and white photo of Rosa Parks, telling her students, "This is what resistance looks like now. Dignified, determined, quiet when it needs to be." But not everyone was celebrating. The airline, after days of silence and cautious PR maneuvers, had finally issued a formal apology. It named Gina this time. It acknowledged that her experience had been deeply regrettable and did not reflect the company's values. It promised an internal investigation and a recommitment to customer dignity. But there were no names, no mention of consequences, no follow-up regarding Cullen or Henderson or any of the employees who had let their biases guide their behavior. It was the sort of apology that hoped to soothe public outrage without ever accepting real fault. Gina didn't reply. She didn't need to. The public had already written its own version of the story, and it was sharper, clearer, and more honest than anything corporate language could offer. Chuck had watched all of it unfold with the same measured gaze he had worn in courtrooms and film sets alike. But this time, it was personal. Not just because it had happened to Gina, but because he knew, deep in his bones, what it meant to have your value questioned before your name was known. His fame had protected him in ways Gina had never asked for. And yet, she had walked through that fire alone, without invoking his name, without demanding attention. And that, to him, had been the most powerful part of it all. She didn't yell, he had told a news anchor when reluctantly agreeing to a short televised interview. She didn't scream. She stood still, and in that stillness, the whole world heard her. Gina hadn't watched the segment. She didn't need to see her husband speak the truth she already knew, but she appreciated that he said it, that he used his voice not to defend her, but to amplify her. By the following Monday, she was back in Washington, D.C., seated on a bench outside Union Station. The weather was brisk but forgiving, the sky a soft slate blue dotted with birds in gentle arcs overhead. She had just finished meeting with a group of young interns working on civil rights policy, a last-minute invitation she had almost declined. But Chuck had encouraged her to go. "You have something to say," he told her, "and they're ready to listen." The conversation with the interns hadn't focused on legislation or policy details. Instead, they had asked her about the airport, about how it felt, about what she thought when they put their hands on her without cause, about the moment she decided not to raise her voice. One of the youngest, a 19-year-old named Talia, from a small town in Kansas, had spoken softly, her voice trembling just a bit. "I saw the video," she said. "I've been treated like that before. I didn't know what to say when it happened. I froze. But you didn't. You didn't say much either, but you made it loud." Gina had blinked slowly, her throat tight. Now, sitting alone in the cold spring air, she thought of that sentence again. You made it loud. She hadn't intended to, but perhaps that was the point. Not every battle needed to be waged with fists or fury. Some needed to be endured with presence, with silence that demanded attention, with dignity that shamed those who tried to strip it away. She adjusted the strap on her shoulder and stood. Her train wasn't for another hour, but she felt ready to go. Not just from the station, but from the shadow of that gate. From the echo of those first moments, being told she didn't belong, being doubted, being dismissed. She had carried them long enough. Now it was time to leave them where they belonged, in the past but never forgotten. Before boarding, she sent a short message to her staff back home. It read, "Next town hall. We open with a story. Not about politics, about people, about what happened at Gate 22B. The response came within minutes. Understood. We'll prepare the space." Back at home, Chuck was tending to the garden. He kept his phone nearby but didn't check it obsessively. He knew she would call when she was ready. In the meantime, he trimmed the roses, humming under his breath, not a song, just a rhythm. A beat he had carried with him since that day in the terminal. The beat of watching his wife, his partner, stand against a system designed to reduce her. Inside, the television played softly. Another anchor recapped the timeline. Another analyst dissected the apology. But Chuck didn't need the analysis. He'd seen enough to know that real change didn't come from sound bites. It came from repetition. From people remembering the story, retelling it, refusing to let it be erased. In cities across the country, others were doing just that. A mural had gone up in Atlanta, Gina's face rendered in vivid color, her eyes forward, unflinching. Beneath it, a quote, "Don't apologize because he came. Apologize because it was wrong." In a school in Minneapolis, students had written essays inspired by her letter. One 10-year-old boy concluded his with, "When I grow up, I want to be like Mrs. Norris, because she didn't let them decide who she was." In a quiet airport lounge in Oregon, a young agent stopped an older black woman and said, "Ma'am, I just want to say, I'm listening now because of her." Gina would never meet most of them. She would never hear most of their stories. But their voices had joined hers, and now the silence that once surrounded this kind of abuse had been fractured. The reckoning wasn't hers alone. It belonged to everyone who had ever been overlooked, spoken down to, pushed aside, or told in 1,000 silent ways that they didn't matter. To everyone who had to prove their worth just to be seen. To everyone who had ever swallowed their pain to make someone else comfortable. She hadn't meant to start anything, but maybe that was the best kind of movement. The kind born not from ambition, but from necessity. From someone standing where no one expected them to, and refusing to disappear. As her train pulled into the station, Gina took a deep breath and stepped forward. And behind her, the world kept listening. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and check out the next video for another powerful story.